Thomas Laqueur. My God. I haven't read your other books because they weren't about dogs or other animals. But The Dog's Gaze makes me want to go not only to read your other two books, but to come to UC Berkeley and enroll in your history classes because I was always daunted. You have this very fancy position. You're the Helen Fawcett Distinguished Professor of History Emeritus at UC California, Berkeley, internationally renowned cultural historian, and you're a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which, by the way, is not a paying membership. You have to be invited. To those of you who think, oh, I'd like to be in that. It's not a club, folks. It's a club of like high minded people. And the American Philosophical Society. So, having said
Even
all that,
more high-minded, even more
much more
high-minded.
high minded and much more obscure and obtuse to like, what are you talking about? So, I thought,
Benjamin Franklin was the first member of that society, I
oh,
want you to know.
nice. Was he a philosopher?
Benjamin Franklin? Well,
Yeah.
he was philosophy in those days meant pursuing rational knowledge
Oh,
and,
my.
and reason. And so Benjamin Franklin founded this to bring science and reason to the benighted colonies.
and
And he was
and
the
I
first
and
he
I
was the
he would
first
be
signature in the
horrified,
book.
but he'd be quite horrified with what we've become. Not
That's
all that
true.
dignified, that's for sure.
That's
But
true.
but this book, The Dog's Gaze, I thought, okay, this is going to be art history, but he's a historian, not an art historian. But then again, the two obviously overlap. This book covers the breadth and the width and the height of everything that humans have ever felt or thought or connected to dogs and other animals. And I don't know how you held all this in your head. Of course, you had notes, but each time you write about something, you say, oh, and 6 centuries earlier, Velasquez. I'm like, how did you remember that? How do you do this when you're teaching a course, Thomas? Is this part of? I'm sure if you had The Dog's Gaze as the name of one of your courses, it would sell out. I know that's not the correct verb, but if you have courses about dogs in history and humans and art, do people flock to hear it? The
Well,
book is yummy.
I haven't ever had a course about dogs and humans and art. And part of being a historian is actually having a reasonably good memory. So what we
Ah,
have to offer is not so much the highbrow thinking of a philosopher, but rather the kind of store of incidents from the past that we try to put together into a meaningful story. But I learned yesterday when I saw a former graduate student of mine that I had actually talked about dogs in art in one of my lectures in 1987. Now,
wow.
I had forgotten that I had been interested in the subject that long. I thought that I hadn't begun thinking about it until 1995 when I went to an exhibit, asked to lecture at an exhibit called The New Child in the 18th Century. And I was struck by how many dogs there were. There were a third of the paintings by these great British painters, Gainsborough and Reynolds and all these guys. A third of them
Right.
had dogs. And I said, that's pretty remarkable. And that's really what I thought got me started on this book. But apparently, I was going on this book almost 10 years before that, if not earlier.
And it took you many of years, decades, quite frankly, to collect all these images, these ideas, and the connective tissue
Right.
between them. And I think what's amazing is that you talk a lot about the Chauvet caves in France and that they didn't have dogs on the wall, but there were dog footprints next to a small young human. Again, you
Yes.
talk historically about how it was decided how large this human would have been and even
Mhm.
how large the dog would have been. And you talk about the position of their paws and feet and how the only thing they could have been doing was looking at these extraordinary, never explained in modern times, paintings on the wall, 900 of them. You have ways of putting ideas together, Thomas, in this book that inspire anyone reading it to think way past the moment or something they remember or something they think they saw somewhere. They ground us in the moment of thinking, isn't that something? The dog is gazing at the art with the man. And a lot of the point of your book is that the gaze of the dog reflects both the artist and what he wants us to look at, reflects the artist, him or herself, and maybe the people in the paintings from centuries apart. Was it only after you looked at reams or rooms full of these images that you recognized that fact, or did it jump out at you immediately?
No, it's a very good question. It took me a while to recognize this fact. So once I was into the project and I was interested in this question of the dog's gaze, so I did more literature searches. So I tried
Yes,
to look at dogs in the Paleolithic. So I came upon
yes,
this wonderful article by a German archaeologist and so paleoarchaeologist about these petroglyphs in the Arabian desert from
yes,
9,000 years ago,
yes,
which, or 10,000 years ago, they're hard to date. And it's just extraordinary to me that someone took that much time at a period when you didn't go to the supermarket for food. You hunted or you didn't eat. Just that much time to paint hundreds of dogs and hunters on these
yes,
giant boulders. And the
yes,
dogs look like our dogs, and they're doing things that our dogs would do in a hunt, and they're looking back at the person and they're looking forward at the game. And so I'm on this track. I then look for other things. And so you find dogs in Iranian pottery from 7 or 8 thousand years ago, and you find dogs in Egyptian art. Then you start looking at petroglyphs and you find dogs or dingoes in the petroglyphs of Australian Aborigines. And how to put it, it's that you start broadening horizontally and you start looking for more things and I try to put them together.
Now, being a professor emeritus, you've been doing this for, as they say, a minute. So, when you first were doing research for your other books and for your courses that you were teaching, and maybe for getting your own doctorate or however many other letters you have after your name, you didn't have the internet. You had to go into a library and go to a card file because I'm old enough, that's how I did research for some of my books, and look through this card file, and then it would take you to a shelf, and then there was a book which might or not might be in the right place. So, could you have done this book then, earlier in your career?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Could I have done that book then? Probably not. I saw a lot of art in person. Most of the art in here I've seen. I suppose in the old days I could have photographed this. I could have developed the pictures, and I could have made a library of photographs. So now I did, as everyone, I did it on my iPhone. I classified
Right.
them.
Yeah,
So
but you also
that's
just to find
that.
them.
Look, that's a really interesting question, and let me try to answer this seriously. My
Yes,
first
I'm
book,
asking seriously.
my first book was on a rather narrow topic, and not only did I have to go to card catalogs, the catalogs of the British Museum were still written in 19th century copperplate. So these
Wow.
were really old and with strange classification systems. But it was a relatively limited topic. I could go into public record offices, archives around England and look for this topic. So I could do that. But later books were not on those kinds of topics. So my next book is called Making Sex, and it's about body and gender from the Greeks to Freud. There's a lot of material. And the work of the dead is even broader and on more subjects. So what did I do? I learned from a historian, an older colleague, that what she did was every time she had an idea and she found something, she wrote it down and she put it in a large folder. So
Hmm.
unlike my thesis where I tried to classify everything,
Right.
this way, if someone said I saw on a tour, I saw a grave somewhere I thought was really interesting, I'd write a note and put it in an envelope. If I went to a restaurant and there were a list of names of World War One memorial next door, I'd put it in an envelope. So I gathered these things in these big envelopes,
I
which I
love it.
then rummaged through. It took decades. Now, of course, you can make these kind of envelopes in
Yes.
minutes on the internet. So in a way, I did write a book, something like The Dog's Gaze, before
Yes.
the internet, but it was harder. And by the end of the work of the Dead Project, the internet was coming in. So it's really
Right.
hard for me to answer the
That's
question.
right. You
I, I started in the old days. I started with these thick envelopes and these folders, and I ended in the world of the internet. And my guess would be that 70% was possible internet, and 30% was the old days of pieces of napkin and spray
yes.
paper in
Yes.
folders. So historians really, our job is collecting stuff like squirrels and collect acorns.
As you
We're
say,
gatherers,
yes, but your brain is also wired to remember things. So I
wired to
think
remember
what,
things and wired to,
right? And
and
connect them.
trying to make connections.
Yes. Yes.
That's our job, to try to make connections between all these little fragments of the past and see how they change. That's exactly
And it's beautiful that it's your gaze, it's Thomas Laqueur's gaze that is looking at the paintings, looking at images that you found, perhaps even accidentally, of Saudi Arabia, picture of a depiction of a person with dogs on leashes. And you say people had dogs on leashes before us, things that we wouldn't stop even to think about. that
Right,
kind of unites us as a human race,
right.
our early versions of us, our current versions, but also there's a number of paintings of the famous kind of painters, Velasquez and Titian, where you say, oh, yes, he borrowed the dog from Titian, or Titian borrowed it from Giotto. I just love
Right.
that idea of borrowing a dog. Can you explain that? Because that idea,
Well,
I mean,
look, most of these great masters knew each other. First of all, in Italy, they were lived close to each other, and
yeah,
secondly, of course, they saw each other's art. And then, of course, things came to be printed in woodcuts,
yes.
and so people see each other's creatures and say, that's interesting. And so Durer's dogs, especially there's a famous set of seven dogs with a Saint Eustache, and that was one of Durer's first great woodcuts and was sold a lot. So hundreds of copies of that
I,
were around, and Durer was famous in his day. So then other artists who paint dogs said, "That's a wonderful dog. I'll steal that dog."
I
And
see.
so then it gets into Mr. Gessner's encyclopedia, and that has, I'm making up the number, but
Right.
1,000 copies. And then Mr. Topsell in England sees Mr. Gessner's encyclopedia and says, "Oh, I like that dog." And he
Isn't
puts the
that
dog in his
something?
long dog section. And so it's a little bit internet, like the internet. It's a little bit that people, one person sees the next guy's thing. It's an early meme, let's put it this way. So
Not plagiarism, it's more like dog napping. I looked at it as dog napping.
right. So Dewar's dogs is probably the most famous, they're an early meme. But there are other sort of famous dogs that get reproduced over the years. I can't think of any right now, but I remember seeing ones that
Well, in the book,
Carpaccio takes a dog, and who does he get it from? God, is it Pontormo? I can't remember right now. But people see each other's art, and they rip it off. It's not the right word, but they
yeah,
say, "Oh, I like that."
they borrow. So, but I think what's interesting about it is that the New York Times recently has been doing a, I don't know how often, they'll say, look at this painting for 10 minutes in the newspaper. I look at the newspaper digitally. And I think, oh, they're going to make me sit there and they're going to tell me what I'm looking at. I don't know what they're going to do. I don't have the patience to sit still for 10 minutes unless I'm doing this show and then I must sit still for half an hour. But it's your book allows us to take those 10 minutes for so many pieces of art because you point out, you see that little dog in the corner? Do you see the white tail of the other dog leaving? Now, the artist put that there to get our gaze to go off to the right, but the dog underneath the man's knee is looking right at you. So, what's that about? It makes us
Well,
look at art so differently, Thomas, the way you looked at it and you point things out to us.
look, but I started to ask this question. Okay, it's possible that sort of every kid that draws a house puts in a tree, it becomes routine. But these artists, you don't have to have a dog; they're not even
Right,
routine. So when artists of the level of Rembrandt and
right.
Velasquez and
And the
Giotto and
Flemish,
these
all
great,
the Flemish.
all these photos you put in a dog, it's not just, oh, well, I happen to put in a dog. I mean, you could
That's right.
almost argue the Dutch, it becomes almost like a meme. Every tavern scene has to have a dog. But the
Yes,
pictures, like you described it, with the dog looking this way and the tail going that way, these are highly structured pictures by people who thought a lot of, that's what artists
yes,
do. They think visually.
yes,
So then I asked myself, what are these guys doing?
right.
Why is it that a person at the level of Dürer has these three master prints that he starts and their dogs and all of them? And Titian does these six poesy paintings, which were thought to be the epitome of art, and three of them have dogs in them. So then you have to ask yourself, really? And
And why? Yeah,
and why? And so then I start looking at it structurally in a formal sense about our gaze, and then also try to look at it emotionally. The dog is looking at someone to make a connection. So when the dog looks back at Adonis who's leaving Venus's arms, it's a look that all of us know with the dog looking back saying, "Can't we go now?" And it's a kind of and and it speaks to affection and our connection with other creatures, other dogs, and in some sense our connection with other people. The dog human connection is not so different from the human dog connection, human connection, in which we look at each other and make gestures and speak with our eyes.
yes,
So that's what got me started. It just the premise that artists of the level that I'm talking about aren't just tossing things in. They're
right,
it's not just a curtain or a putti in the sky or something.
right.
There's
Or a nice bowl of fruit.
a nice bowl of fruit. They're really doing something. And
Yeah.
so my question then became, what are they doing?
Yes.
And then I try to look at that more carefully. And then I'm trying to say, how are they doing it? That sort of big blob of white paint in its eye, or whatever the technique might be. So I'm looking closely to try to see how they're doing it, and try to say that also, that the dog's eye is so beautifully drawn tells you something about what the artist wanted us to see in eyes.
Yes.
It's,
A lot of it's about the human canine bond because a
yes,
lot of the writing you do is about what did those dogs at that time in history, what was their place in society? What was their place in the arms of these grand, rich masters,
right.
or just in, as you said, a pub scene or a scene where a princess is being dressed?
But they're also in other scenes. Artists wanted to
Yes.
imagine them with the poor. So people seem to have had
Yes.
dogs longer than we think. We always think of dogs, as you say, as accessories for the rich in these paintings. And pets began with the royalty and then the bourgeoisie. But as far as we can tell, dogs were around poor people a lot and hung
Yes.
around with them, and they expected to have them. And painters, when they painted scenes of peasants, seemed to think that they needed to have a dog
Yes.
connecting. So it's more democratic than I think had been thought before.
Definitely, because I was just expecting to see a lot of very beautiful Stubbs. He was
Exactly.
horse one, of course,
Right,
but a
right,
lot of
right.
very beautiful British depictions and think, ooh, I would like that on my wall. That kind of feeling about
Right.
beautiful art that has a beautiful horse or a gorgeous dog in it. But it's so much richer and deeper than that because you go back to prehistoric caves and not just in France, but other places where there were depictions of animals and the presumption by you and other historians of how dogs were part of that world at that time. I
Right.
think it's a sweeping view with art being the kind of boat that we're riding on, but we're looking on both banks, if you will, of a river. But you're the one telling us what to look at. And I think it helps us to see art very differently. It is like taking an art course. Why? It does, as you said, a number of places you point out that the artist has a dog who would otherwise just be sleeping or just sitting off there. But wait, you said he has a little white impasto in the eye, and notice the red tongue. And you think, ah, that's by choice. That artist did this intentionally because for me, the viewer, and showing me, the artist, looking out at me, this person, all these years later, or perhaps at the time.
Yeah.
It's what, and I don't know, there's just other marvelous things. You have a whole chapter on why not cats. Why didn't you
Right.
write the book about cats or about horses? And in there you have the little sketch by Leonardo da Vinci showing Mary and the baby Jesus, and the baby Jesus is trying to hold on to a cat that's trying to escape.
Right.
And it was just a sketch. It never turned into a painting. But it's just this wonderful realization that dogs were so important to everybody across the across centuries and across cultures, not to mention across social strata. It's really quite
Right.
a
Well,
journey
the
you
thing
take
with
us
cats is
on.
interesting. What people love about cats is that they're still basically in most art and in much of life, cats aren't paying attention to you. And then sometimes
Right,
they are, and you feel very
right.
pleased that a cat's paying attention to you. That's the trope. And so in the most famous cat in the Courbet painting, the artist in the studio, I point out that the cat is underneath the easel, looking into the easel at a mouse. And the
Yes.
painting is a bit the Courbet thumbing his nose at the establishment, and people think he associates himself with the cat. But the cat is basically saying, I'm not paying attention to you. Now, the dog in the painting is paying attention to someone. And the thing about dogs that cat people might like so much is that they pay attention all the time. They're
Hmm.
constantly demanding,
You say that in the
as
book.
as as are
Yeah.
your fellow human beings, frankly.
Yes. Yes.
And so there's a sense in which cats are one side, if you wish, of the civilizational divide. The leave me alone version, and dogs are the other side of the civilizational divide. The other thing, it's interesting, you went back several times to these caves. One of the points I wanted to make, and just still thinking about, is that humans have lived with dogs. We don't know exactly how long, but 10, 12,000 years longer than any other animal. I mean,
That's
we've
right.
had a long time to look at dogs, and dogs look at us. And the evolutionary history, which I think is one of the things that I discovered relatively late, I thought about relatively late in the process, and is really important, is that almost every account of how evolution happens is that the dogs start doing things with humans. Now, whether humans first followed wolves or wolves first followed humans, We don't know, but we do
Right.
know that wolves are creatures that hunt by looking at each other with eye contact,
That's right.
and humans look around the next hunter over and make these gestures. And so, in some sense, the evolution grows out of mutual looking. So that's a kind of, to me, it's interesting point that evolution creates a creature probably uniquely that wants to look at us and whose gaze we return. And then the interesting thing is, how does that become engaged in culture? And so my argument was that we've been hunting with these guys for making up the number again,
Right.
12,000,
Right.
14,000 years. And then that becomes the stuff of myth and storytelling. Probably the first stories we told were
Yeah.
about great hunts, and those become parts of myths, and then myths become parts of art. So evolution,
Yes.
in some sense, and then the other things we do with dogs, like hanging out, and that becomes part of other stories. Oh,
So
and so
some
in
of the
some sense, evolution gets into culture and produces art. And so what we're seeing, the dog's gaze and the art of the dog is in some sense very long evolutionary history um, coming to canvas, if you will.
And you bring that to bear as a historian, certainly of Greek mythology and other mythology. There are some paintings in there where you say, this one's a little mixed up. It's got two or three mythological stories in this one canvas. But we, as a much less educated looker, are just looking at, oh, the naked woman's breasts, or, yeah, maybe we're looking at the dog. But wait a
Right,
minute, that's right. That is two myths mixed together. Isn't that
right, right,
quite a
right, right,
hodgepodge,
right,
but a good
right.
hodgepodge?
Exactly. No, that you mix they mix up the stories and artists mix up the stories. But the other thing with speaking of the Greeks is the Greeks had dogs in all sorts of other paintings, and they basically figured out dog gestures 2,500 years ago. So right
Mm-hmm.
now, if you look online or anywhere, it says, "What does your dog mean when it's crouching down and has its head up? It wants to play. What does
Right.
your dog mean when it's looking up at you? It says it wants food." Or those kinds of gestures.
Right.
The Greeks had figured this out
That's
2,500
right.
years ago. And so when a dog is walking along with someone and it turns its head back, it means just what it means today. Are you coming along? So in some sense, humans have been interested in the meaning of dog gestures for a very long time, and not just in Greek art, but in other art as well. So we've been trying to understand dog language, so to speak, since forever,
You've
almost.
done, we've run out of time, but you've done an amazing job of bringing together art and culture and history and the human animal bond, and a wonderful, we didn't have time to talk about the introduction about you and your family and your grandfather back in Germany and escaping the Nazis and the dogs that were in their lives, both in Germany and then when they got out. It's an amazing book, Thomas. The Dog's
Well,
Gaze, a
I'm so happy
visual
that
history.
you liked it.
I loved it. And I think there are so many different ways that people will love it. It's just, it's a cornucopia. It really is. It's so chock full of ideas and gorgeous images, just so beautiful.
It
It's
is beautiful book.
so much easier than spending 3 days in the Metropolitan Museum or in the Louvre or in the Pitti Palace or anywhere else. Just this book is a tour through the world's biggest museum. Thomas Laqueur, it's really a wonderful book.
It was really a pleasure talking to you. Thank
And
you
to you as well. It
for
was a great
inviting me.
pleasure. Take care.
Goodbye. Goodbye.